Hello dear chess enthusiasts, this is the d4, d5 chess school with you again. As the saying goes, live and learn. And new moves by opponents in the opening keep revealing themselves to me. The names of new openings. That's exactly what happened this time as well. Playing e4, I get the response e6. As usual, you expect the French defense, which black achieves with the move d5. Sometimes, of course, opponents play b6 or c5 trying to transition into the Sicilian defense, but those are all just daggers. These are all classically known openings, but here the opponent surprises me with the pawn move d7 to d6. We turn to the sources, look up the name of the opening, and see Rat Defense. In fact, the position that arises from this structure is very similar to the Rat Defense. White seems to have an active position, everything looks good, but then you see that your opening advantage disappears in the middle game. The position is somehow equal, and then, bam, you lose in the middle game. Some kind of a rat trap. Yes, the opening of course is not objectively the strongest, because black allows white to take the center, and should of course try to undermine it. d5 is the main move, but d6 is rather dubious, yet practice shows that it's actually very hard for white to break through the defense with simple moves here. Black's idea is very simple. They try to free up these squares for their knights, and naturally they develop their bishops onto the long diagonals, that is, they include them. Then at some point the rat-like undermining begins, c5, d5, e5 or f5, depending on the structure that appears on the board. Well, for example, if white plays knight to f3, the question is how the game continues in a typical fashion. Knight to d7, bishop to d3, white develops and gets a comfortable position. It seems everything is going well for them. Black also sets up their own formation. Here the bishop can be developed to e3. Black develops rook to e1, knight to f6. By the way, in this case the knight can go to f6. It's not necessary to play it to a7, although moving it to a7 is also a possible move. White sets up in the standard way when playing against a fianchettoed bishop. A battery is formed with the idea of going for an exchange. Black pays attention and castles. It turns out that black has quite a pleasant position. After bishop to a6, the move c5 comes immediately. After the bishops are exchanged, you have to decide on the pawn structure. It makes sense to play d5 trying to shut down the bishop, but after the exchange, the pawn will somewhat restrict the bishop. However, here a6 is played with the idea of a pawn push on the queen side. If we interfere, then rook to e8, fighting for the e-file, and some exchanges may follow. The computer basically says that the position is already equal and white hasn't achieved anything. And so this situation arises very, very often. For example, in this position, people have tried bringing the bishop out to g5 more actively to attack. But this doesn't prevent black from developing their bishop. Their pieces follow the plan, the bishop goes to g7, and you can go here again, you can make some abstract move and see that black starts to get additional opportunities here. And in some situations, the computer already prefers to play for black, like playing a 6, chasing away the bishop, then g5, then the knight jumps to g6, and again, some of these sneaky undermining moves will follow sooner or later. But f5 also happens. In this situation, maybe it's not entirely relevant, but that kind of break is also possible. And so, very complex positions actually arise. And today we will analyze a game between two such 19th century classics, Louis Paulsen and Joseph Henry Blackburne. But before that, I'd like to note that, trying to avoid the rat defense, which was unpleasant, I started the game with d4. Well, I'm telling you, there will be no rats today. My opponent plays d6, but of course he's trying to lure me into playing e4, then he'll reply with e6 and it'll be the rat defense again. But not this time. I play not a4 but c4 and get the reply e5. I turn to the sources. What do you think? English red, the English rat. No matter how you turn it, there are rats everywhere. In fact, this situation already occurs much more often, even at the grandmaster level. So it's relevant, and from a theoretical standpoint that's good. This setup unlike the previous one. There are games with this position played by Nimzowitsch himself, Nezhmetdinov, and even our modern top grandmasters, Aronian, Anand. There's even a Karpov Anand game. And what makes this rat variation interesting? The fact is, of course, grandmasters develop their pieces here, but it's appealing to amateur chess players because you can trade, exchange queens, deprive black of castling, and be happy that after castling you can give a check to the king. But in reality, white has nothing here. And they can even end up with a slightly worse position. Just like in the game against Nimzowitsch. Look, the knight is developing. White is already 2 moves away from castling. Black brings out the bishop, attacking the pawn. The pawn needs to be defended. Well, the bishop can defend it by playing a4. The other bishop comes out to this pawn, putting pressure on it. Again, it needs to be defended. And if you try to play in your aggressive style anyway, give a check. And after the block, go for a long castle with check. White has come all this way just for that. Black can simply calmly move to e8. And the position is already in black's favor. Slightly. Of course, that's the computer's evaluation. But it already says, I would play this position as black. Here, black is already better. Indeed, this correspondence scheme is very tricky. Because here, most amateurs capture everything, trade everything, deprive the opponent of castling, and get nothing in return. And they lose as white. So keep this correspondence defense in mind. Let's turn to a game that was played in Manchester in 1861. The classics, Louis Paulsen, at that time, if I'm not mistaken, the second best chess player in the world after Paul Morphy, and Joseph Henry Blackburne. So e4 to e6, d4 to d6, the rat defense, Paulsen plays bishop to d3. Let's not get into the opening details, we know how black sets up in this structure, you see? Henry does exactly the same. By the way, if you're playing bullet, or for example, you have an Armageddon game where you're black and playing without an extra minute, but a draw suits you, in principle, you could try using this opening because you can just rattle it off quickly. The first 10 moves is black regardless of what white does, and you'll save a ton of time. And what's more, you'll get a position that's not lost but actually quite springy, where all the pawns can burst forward at the right moment. That's the kind of rat-like scheme for bullet games. So, knight to d2, knight to d7, f4. We see that Paulsen ultimately decides not to leave just 2 pawns in the center, but adds a third one, f4. Sometimes, of course, some people also play c4, f4. And here, since the pawn has moved to f4, Blackburne changes his plan. He brings the knight not to a 7, although that's also a good move, but to h6. Because now there is a threat to play g4 and exchange the knight for the bishop. This exchange will look good for black. Then white plays nf3, freeing up the square for the bishop. Here, black already has some pawn breaks available. The c5 break is very tempting here, it really begs to be played. But in the game, Blackburne played f5, attacking from the other side. Naturally, the white pawn moves forward, trying to exclude Chernopolnik from the game. They expect the opponent to castle short, but the red scheme, therefore the blacks will act in the same spirit. f7. Black has not yet determined the position of his king. They say, we will most likely castle in this direction, but maybe in that direction too. White plays queen d2 for now, but I really didn't like this move at all, because the bishop gets locked in, and again the move knight g4 appears, and in this case, it's already impossible to avoid the exchange. Against such rat-like schemes, you also have to play very cunningly, and here I like the move b4. b4 is a move that immediately tells us that if black castles long, their king will be doomed to suffer. And most likely white will force black to castle short, and the pawn on b4 is actually placed quite well. Yes, but in the game there was one move, queen to d2, and instead of knight to g4, the reply was knight to f7. But this move is a bit worse. Of course, the knight should have jumped to g4. And now all of white's pieces are developed. The white rook moves from the queen side to the center to d1. And as soon as it moved, black castled. Again, a sneaky trap. Now you have to bring the rook back and push the pawn to try to open up the file. Black keeps doing everything differently from what white wants. But now it's not Holtz who brings the rook back, and then the pawn on a4 advances on its own. All the more so since, fortunately, black has a weakness on b6 in their position. It will be easier to speed up the game. Black relieves the center with the move dxe. White captures fxe. Since the pawn has left the f4 square, now black has the idea of advancing the g-pawns. Well, g5 definitely needs to be pushed, and then we'll see what happens next, either g4 or f4. Because our play is with, Raikirov sends them in different directions. In this case, we're interested in attacks on the kings. There were possibly several ways to prepare g5. Blackburne played h6 with the idea of then pushing g5. I preferred the move rook to g8, because the rook would be active and the pawn could advance without weakening the position. A6 still has a small drawback. The pawn is left undefended, and in some lines you had to consider the move knight to f4, threatening the pawn and a fork. but Paulsen pushes the pawn forward to a5. And here it's very strange that black didn't continue their plan, that is, they didn't play g5. They said, we should be grateful and carry out our own plan. Instead, a very weak move followed. The move b5. It's not a good move, because it's not recommended to push pawns on the flank where you're weaker. And in this case, after this move, the king clearly won't feel any safer. The position won't be improved. Naturally, white plays a6, using the tempo to attack the bishop. The bishop hides on a8. And in this situation, it was exactly possible to highlight that the move h6 was a bad one. Here, Paulsen had the opportunity to play knight f4, attack this pawn, and while black was defending it, capture it, here on b5. And the resulting position after all these exchanges is in white's favor, strongly in white's favor if I'm not mistaken. The evaluation is around +3 to +4. The engine basically says black is doomed here. After knight f4, bishop takes on b5 followed immediately. It's the same kind of simplification because the d-file is open and the pawn on d4 is pinned. But in this situation, look, white's knight is not as active as in the previous one. This position and the one I just analyzed, see the difference? Do you see? Here, of course, white's knight is much more active and there are far more chances. In this situation, of course, the knight isn't on f8 but on e5, and then there's the jump to ng4. And from this moment on, the game is simply brilliant. The moves the opponents found were incredible, such beauty. So, the bishop retreats to f4 naturally and immediately e5 follows. e5 attacking the bishop, white captures with d takes e. And here in principle, black could have already pushed g5, using such an in-between move. Blackburne decided to take the pawn on e5 with the knight. The knight goes to a5, and the other knight goes to d4. And now, the specific move that black played right here is actually very hard to find in a practical, real-world game. But for a while, both opponents were finding the strongest moves in the position. Here, black plays c5. But who would dare to play c5 with the queen on c3 and the king on c8? Everything is very concrete, everything is very complicated. And here, you get the feeling that some trouble is brewing. It would have been better to move the king to h1 in advance. Nothing serious is hanging yet, but the king should have been moved quickly, because at some point something could come down the open diagonal and the king's awkward position would become a problem. Rook f to e1. Instead, this move was played, a very natural move. The rook pins the knight. Rook takes on d4 follows. It seemed like an empty move. How can you take the knight? The pawn is pinned. It doesn't protect the rook. Naturally, rook takes d4, Paulsen wins the exchange and knight to f3. Oh my goodness, what's happening? Everything is just hanging, all the pieces are attacking each other, it's chaos on the board. And let me tell you, by the way, this game was played blindfolded. What are they doing? And here, Stockfish says, guys, everything's fine, don't worry. Knight to f1, evaluation is 3-0. Everything is equal, everything is under control, but who could stay calm here? And the move knight to f1 was not found. Paulsen takes the knight, and from this moment the evaluation drops sharply. Now black already has the advantage. Bishop takes on d4 with check, attacking the queen. The king retreats to g2. The bishops here are just incredibly powerful. The queen goes to h4. With the bishop attacking, the white queen is still hanging, the bishop is hanging. What to do? The only move here is bishop to g3, and that's what was played. And here, Blackburne couldn't stop himself. This is where Ostap got carried away. He should have played very simply. The fight is over, and it's time to reap the rewards. That is, just exchange everything you can. Bishop takes on c3, bishop takes on h4. Just exchange everything and go into the endgame with an extra exchange. Black has simply an extra exchange and a very good chance to win. And as you can see, the number of pawns is the same. Instead of this, Blackburne decided that it wouldn't be the endgame to decide the outcome, but rather to finish off the white king. And he plays queen to g4. He puts his queen under attack by a pawn, which is pinned. It's just beautiful, guys. Amazing what they're doing. But actually this move isn't good, because he should have gone for the endgame. And Paulsen felt this, he plays queen to b3, threatening to invade with a check on his 6. Black again plays the best move, f4. The queen defends the e6 square. The pawn pushes forward and attacks the pinned bishop. Bishop to c4, and Paulsen insists that you absolutely have to give a check on e6. And here the situation becomes very tense, and Blackburne should have bailed out already. He should have gone into a bad endgame at this point. That is, he should have exchanged on f3, queen takes f3, bishop takes f3, king takes f3, pawn takes g. And we see that now white will get... The endgame is very pleasant, but for white to have such a significant advantage in this position, it was necessary to make a very strong and precise move. Rook to e7? Then yes, white would have a very serious advantage. Other continuations, such as taking the pawn on g3 with either the king or the pawn, of course, gave black chances. Here for salvation. But that would have been better, because in the game the following move was played. Queen to g5, and from this moment on there was no saving it anymore. The position for black was lost. Here, there are two moves that give a serious advantage. The human move, which was also found according to Paulsen, is bishop to g8. The rook is cut off and now out of the game. And the rook's invasion is threatening somewhere. A very strong move. Well, Stockfish, of course, is mocking us. It shows another move, but I'll just show you. Maybe even without commentary, just watch. Rook to e7. What is it doing? It just gives up the rook for nothing, and says that this is the strongest move. There is no longer any salvation for black. After the capture, a series of checks will follow, and the bishops quite literally tear the enemy king completely apart. Just as recently the black bishops were powerfully attacking white, now it's all the other way around. Everything has changed. Now white is attacking black. Yes, and there is no salvation. Despite black having an extra rook, their king is just being pummeled. Checks, checks, there's no defense against them. The bishop is captured, check, and then a very beautiful quiet move. Pawn to the 7th, simply finishing things off. Lovely. Well, of course no human would have played like this. Rook to a7, bishop to g8, that's a human move. Blackburne hurries to block the e-file with bishop to e3, so the rook can't break through, but the collapse can't be stopped. Rook takes on e3, f takes e3, queen to b8 check, the bishop has moved, and now the b8 square is under white's control. And after king to d7 and queen takes a 7 check, as the song goes, "Stop Henry, he needs to leave." Here, Henry Blackburne resigned, because there is no salvation. The king is simply getting mated. Somewhere on some square, he will inevitably be checkmated, because all the diagonals are open, the files and ranks are open. A lone king in such situations always gets checkmated. A beautiful game, but also a very tricky opening that we've just looked at. This is the Rat Defense, or the English Rat, which is actually quite acceptable in principle. And I recommend playing exactly this variation as black, specifically the English Rat, if you do not like dealing with the Queen's Gambit after d5 and so on. Play d6, and after c4 you can go e5. And as you've already realized, exchanging queens and depriving white of castling doesn't give white anything at all. Only black will have chances here. Well, if you enjoyed this video lesson, please give it a like and share it on social media. See you next time, goodbye.